Hey everyone, it's Carter. Welcome to this episode of Making It Up, the show where I get to sit down and chat with other writers and kind of compare myself to them, see if they're more successful than me. That's not true at all. I just like talking to writers. I like to find out what their deal is and what it was that made them want to go into, a pretty unforgiving business. So today's episode features Graham Hurley. So Graham is somebody who I was not familiar with, and he got pitched to me as a guest, and this guy is fascinating. So Graham has written over 25 novels, a lot of historical fiction, and his most recent work, The Last Flight to Stalingrad, which is just now out in paperback as well, is doing very well, and the Times called it historical fiction of the highest order. So that's high praise indeed. And Graham was just fascinating to talk to. His father was in World War II, and he talks about just how, even as a teenager, he started really getting obsessed with World War II books and World War II stories, and he himself wrote 5 novels by the time he was 18. So he's a very prolific writer. And at the end of our conversation, we make up a story using a random sentence from the nonfiction book Unbroken, which is a World War II story. So anyway, Graham was fascinating. I think you'll find him fascinating as well. This is my conversation with Graham Hurley. Good to see you. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, good to see you. Yeah, nice to meet you.
So you're in England. Whereabouts?
I am indeed, and the weather is unbelievable. I mean, It's really great.
Uncharacteristically wonderful?
Well, it's uncharacteristically consistent, so it's consistently wonderful, and that makes it puts it in the top echelon of being superbly wonderful. It's quite cold, but I haven't seen a cloud for nearly 2 weeks.
Oh wow! Well, you look tan, and that's kind of uncommon, I would say, if I were to stereotype an Englishman.
Right. Whereabouts are you then, Carter?
I'm in Colorado, central U.S.
And in Denver, or?
Yep, just outside of Denver. So right at the cusp of the Rocky Mountains.
Okay.
So, and where in the UK are you?
We're in a county. How well do you know the UK?
Not great. I've been to England a handful of times, but you're going to tell me names that I'll be like, okay, no, sure.
If you imagine the shape of the country, we live on the bottom left-hand corner in the boot.
Okay.
And it's a county called Devon, and it's right up close to Cornwall. It's exceptionally beautiful, and it's cloud-free, which makes it very special.
So it's coastal.
It's coastal. We live in a little town called Exmouth, which, as the name suggests, is on the mouth of the River Exe. It's stunningly beautiful, I must say. We're really, really blessed. And my wife and I, we row. We're part of a rowing club, and it's coastal rowing. And it's the kind of place that gives you all kinds of options. So no matter what the sea state or the tide or the weather or whatever, you can go out to sea, you can go along the coast, you can go up the river towards Exeter, which we did this morning. And we've been doing it for about 16 years, and it's absolutely blissful.
That's right, 100%. So you're born and raised in the UK then?
Yeah, I am. Yep. We've always lived by the sea, my wife and I. We didn't meet until sort of midlife, but I've always lived by the sea. I grew up in a little town called Clacton-on-Sea, which is in the east of England, very flat, which is the key. Post-war child, had the great good fortune to grow up in a house without a television, no TV. And I think that probably shaped the rest of my life, because there were just the 3 of us, my mum, my dad, and myself. My dad was far too mean to buy a TV. He was. We didn't get a TV until 1966 when we were in the World Cup. In fact, in the World Cup final, we won the final. And he was a huge classical music buff. And we used to have a sort of early supper, the 3 of us. And then, because he was a fair man, he'd draw up the armchairs around the steam radio, And he'd offer me as a 8-year-old, 9-year-old a choice of Brahms, Beethoven, Bruckner, whatever it might be, Bach. And of course, at that age, you have no interest at all. And particularly during the winter months, I used to develop one of those tactical sick headaches. And I totter up to bed always with an armful of books. When I say that the best present my mum ever gave me, apart from the loan of her bike, was a library ticket, and I used to haunt the library. And the second stroke of luck, I guess, apart from not having a TV, was that when I got into reading real books and took that step literally upwards into the adult library,
right,
I collided head on with that tidal wave of books that came out of the Second World War. And they could be nonfiction, they could be Reach for the Sky, The Waves Above Us, all that kind of stuff, or they could be fiction, The Cruel Sea. But I absolutely adored them, and it took me. It was my introduction to the real magic of words and language, and what's possible, in your phrase, if you make it up.
right.
Of course, if you're writing about a real war, you're not making it up, particularly if you've just served in it. And rather later in life, I became a documentary maker for 20 years, and I've got some experience of wars, and wars are horrible things. But the one thing you cannot argue about is that in war, stuff happens to people.
Right.
And this stuff found its way onto the pages of countless books in the Clacton-on-Sea adult library. And there was little me picking up armfuls week after week and putting them in my mum's wicker basket on front of the bike and pedaling off through the windy darkness. And you get the picture. I mean,
So your father was likely a part of the war?
Yeah, he flew in a 2-engine, 2-seater plane called a Beaufighter.
So he was part of the RAF.
He was in the RAF, yeah. He learned his flying in Florida and in Canada.
Do you have a sense now of what he went through personally?
Well, not firsthand. I mean, he wasn't the most emotional of men or expressive of men, and there's a limit to what you can put into a logbook. And so you get brief, staccato, 2-line entries that would simply record takeoff time, landing time, and what might have happened in between. And by and large, of course, the story is that not a lot happened in between.
Right, right. But you have a sense of how many sorties he flew.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, it's great stroke of luck. His pilot, he was the navigator, and his pilot was a man called Ginger. And my dad, I don't know, perhaps too many sorties, developed a boil on his arse, and he had to go to hospital. And 2 days later, when he should have been in the navigator's seat, Ginger got it wrong on landing and killed the spare navigator and killed himself. So
wow,
that rather shook my dad, and it would have shaken me, I'm sure, like this morning did, must say.
Right. So you're a kid growing up, and you're reading these books. Do you think knowing that your father had served do you think that was the attraction for you to gravitate specifically towards those types of books?
Yes, but the real credit belongs to the people who wrote the books, and this began to fascinate me. So just to toss a few names at me: Nicholas Montserrat, Alistair MacLean, Hammond Innes. Now these were people these were authors who had to have fought in that war. So The Guns of Navarone came from the pen of Alistair MacLean, and every page to me as a young reader reeked of authenticity. You know, I could be on that cliff face in the roaring wind and trying to hang on and trying to, not get myself killed because of gravity or the Germans or wherever it might be. And they had what I now recognize is the skills of the storyteller. And right. Those skills, as you all know, above all, are incredibly powerful. And going back to your first question, I think if my dad had sat me down and had tried to get across the reality of what it was like to sit in his Beaufighter in the pitch darkness hunting for um, for German planes or German convoys or whatever, then he wouldn't have made as good a job as Maclean or Hammond Innes or Nicholas Montserrat. So the specialness of the writer began to really fascinate me and preoccupy me. And I remember that there came a sort of epiphanic moment, you know, and I was 14 years old, and it was during the holidays. And I remember standing in that library and looking around and looking at all those titles on the spines of all those books and all those shelves and all those authors' names, and thinking, you know what, this writing business can't be that difficult, because look, here's the evidence. So many people have done it. Right. I mean, behind you now.
And there has to be tons of money in it too.
Well, I haven't quite got that far, but it was just extraordinary. And I remember going home to my mum and saying, you know, it had to be a Friday, and I said, I'm going to have the weekend off, Mum, but on Monday I'm going to become a novelist. And I thought about this. And if you wouldn't mind laying hands on a typewriter, because all good novelists need a typewriter, and I need a supply of foolscap paper, that's how long ago it was, and carbon copies, because without a shadow of a doubt, the rest of the world will need to share in my first launch title. And bless her, she went off and did it. She devoted most of the weekend.
That's great.
Well, except that she called my bluff, you know.
Right, right. Now you got to do it.
Found me sitting down in front of their card table in the only posh room in the house, which of course was unheated, middle of winter, doing the writerly thing, staring at a blank sheet of paper. Right. And believe me, Carter, not much has happened to this 14-year-old. And I'm thinking, well, the one thing I haven't done is to wonder what I'm going to write about. And of course, it's then that you realize just what tricky stuff language is. Right. I mean, it's really difficult.
Well, it's so interesting, right? Because the normal 14-year-old wants the guitar, and you give him the guitar and he's going to teach himself, and at least he can start getting a few chords going, make a couple sounds. With a blank piece of paper and an idea that you want to be a novelist, there's really no easy starting point to that. There's no chords. There's no chords to learn. It's just blank death waiting you. So I can see that being very defeating.
How did it work or not work for you then when you first encountered the blank
so I had a bit of an epiphany as well. I didn't start writing until I was 33. And I was in a business degree and working in real estate. And I was taking a class, and I was bored out of my mind, and I posed myself a riddle that I just made up, and I decided to spend the rest of the class trying to answer that riddle. They're kind of a murder mystery riddle.
Can you remember what the riddle was?
Yeah, it was if three people are murdered at the exact same time in the same fashion in different parts of the world, what's the connection? So I'm like, I'm going to find out I'm going to make a little story that answers this question to kill the time. Okay. Right. And I couldn't figure it out by the end of the class. So I went home and I kept writing a little bit more, and I kept noodling at it. And in 90 days, it turned into a 400-page manuscript. And I had never done anything like that before. And so I had to stop myself and say, I wonder if this is meaningful. This is, I mean, I know it's not good, but I've done something pretty meaningful. And that was 20 years ago, and I haven't stopped writing since.
Right. Did it take you by surprise then?
100% by surprise. I mean, I come from a fairly creative family, but mostly on the artistic side, on actual painting, and I don't have any of that talent at all. So I was, it was surprising enough where I really stopped and took note of, like, I should listen to whatever voice told me to do this, because maybe this is what I'm supposed to be doing. So, I've and I still have my other job, but like now I'm a dedicated full-time writer. And for you, so you knew at a very early age that was your passion. And then you went to school and studied English. Is that right? A bachelor's and a master's in English.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I between from the point of the epiphany in the library to going to university, I went off to Cambridge, and I read English in the belief that after 5 mercifully unpublished novels, I mean, they were the world's worst novels, but they enabled me to serve a kind of apprenticeship, I think, and I began to understand how the business of putting character and story and circumstance and plot and everything else on the page sort of worked.
So what was that timeline that you wrote 5 unpublished novels?
That was between 14 and 18.
Jesus. So,
yeah,
so
you can't accuse me of not trying.
All right. So your mom was well justified in buying you that typewriter. Like you didn't let it go to rot. So that's well done.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I believed then. Well, I began to slowly realize, and I believe absolutely now, and you may sign up to this, that writing is a sort of virus, and once you've got it in the bloodstream, it doesn't leave you.
That's right.
And I'm fascinated by the reasons why that may be true. It's certainly true with me. And I think that some people say, being a novelist is the last refuge for the ultimate control freak. And I think that's probably right. That you create worlds that are entirely of your making. Though the older you get and the wiser you get and the more people that you make it your business to talk to and get alongside and try and win their trust and everything else. And making documentaries was a really, really, really good training for that, because you had to find the story. You had to befriend the people who would make the story work on screen. You had to get it out of them. And you had to do the novelist thing. You had to clamber into their heads and clamber into their hearts and try and figure out what it was like to be them. And then go through the whole nausea of having made friends with them, hopefully, and having got the story. And there'd be, it was often in the pub or wherever. But then you've got the whole business of recreating the thing on screen. But I'm a huge believer in the fact that to write decent novels, you've got to be the posh word is curious. You've got to be curious. You've got to be nosy. You've got to want to find out what it's like for the guy or the woman or whatever you're talking to. And in that respect, I think that when I was at university and for the 2 or 3 years beforehand, I used to hitchhike everywhere because I had no money. And looking back again, I think that was incredibly important, because the minute you get into the lorry cab or a stranger's car, you enter into a sort of contract. They may be taking you from, in this case, Clacton to London. So that's going to be 2 hours. And the contract requires you to talk to them, to keep them amused. And after a while, I became quite good at this. And it occurred to me that often in these situations, they'd be lying to me for whatever reason. And so I began to make up stories about my own background. And this worked really well until you happened to meet the same guy and you couldn't remember who you were before.
Right.
Hopefully that didn't happen. But I think the business of and it teaches a sort of humility, actually. Listening is a dying art in our culture.
Right.
But people don't listen anymore. Well, they don't in this country. Particularly the young. They have no interest in listening. And life becomes a kind of competition for who shouts loudest. And there is so much, not just so many novels in terms of listening to other people, but there is so much wisdom to be picked up by trying to figure out what it's like for the other guy.
You're 100% right. And when you said curious, I think, so, I always say there's 3 things that I think you really need to be a novelist, and curiosity is one of them. And the other 2 are empathy. I think it's really important that you're just a naturally empathetic person, because you can be curious, but can you really convey and feel what it is like to be that person? So if you're walking around in someone's head and you're that character, it'll show on the page whether or not you are capable of deep wells of empathy. And third, I think you have to be committed. Because you can easily have those first 2 and get very bored typing up a story. And that's where I think writing to exercise is it's a muscle that you build over time. And after a while, you're like, oh, the actual writing part is actually not so hard anymore because I've built that muscle. Whereas when I first started out, every sentence was like trying to run for the first time. I'm getting exhausted. And it's so I think without those 3 things, I think it's really hard to continue to be a writer. It's easy to want to pull it off.
That's right. Yeah. Completely agree. the word muscle is very interesting, and I think as you write more and more books, and I've now written a load of books, published books, and I think that your writing repertoire, the number of to adopt a cheesy musical metaphor, the number of things you can do with your instrument thicken and thicken and thicken, and the range of notes deepens and extends, and you become, I don't know if for you, but I put particularly when I'm writing historical fiction, which I'm doing at the moment, and it's a real trip. I mean, I'm really enjoying it, but the amount of reading I have to do is phenomenal. And then you get down to the actual writing, and this is a series that features a number of characters, and they vary in importance from book to book. So some will be downstage in book one. He'll toss the narrative lead to character 2 in book 2, and so forth. So I'm never stuck with the same main character, and I increasingly, I've done my research, I've typed up my notes, I know exactly how the chronology is going to work, how the timeline is going to work, how the plot's going to thicken, and so forth. And then it comes down to the M word. I don't know if you can share this, but the word M stands for momentum, and there comes a writing of every third when something rather magical takes over, and you cease going to bed, the following day, and how the story is going to revive, blah blah. But because something beyond you has taken over, and it's often to do with character, and the characters have seized the beginnings of the first green shoots of your plot, and they've taken it in directions that you least expect, and this is the moment when you have to, in my view, trust your characters, and that's when the momentum takes over. And at that point, the thing becomes a real ride. I mean, it's great.
Well, that's one of the great joys of writing, right? So that's why I don't outline, mostly because I'm incapable of it. But I find when I start to outline and I say, okay, I know what at least the next 3 chapters are going to be, probably a chapter in, I start deviating because I keep asking myself, well, what if this happened? What if that happened? Because there's so many interesting things that can happen. And the discovery process of that as a writer, I think, is where I find my real joy. That's where I sit down and I'm like, wow, I didn't see this coming at all. What happens if I do that? What are the impacts on the story? And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But if I had everything outlined from start to finish, I don't know if I would have as much fun writing it.
Yeah, no, you're right. I had a fascinating conversation with a guy called Pete Turner, on the Break It Down show.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, I just recently did that.
Pete Turner does what you do, and you both do it very well, which is to master the arts of conversation and etc. And it turned out that he'd spent some considerable time with the CIA in counter-espionage in some fairly dodgy areas. So we're talking Middle East, we're talking Sarajevo during the Balkan crisis.
Oh wow, yeah.
And it was his job again to get alongside people, and we were trying to tease out the parallels between the two jobs. His job, which was infinitely more important than mine will ever be, and my job as a writer and a novelist, and there were endless points of comparison and points of similarity.
Yeah,
and they had to do with getting under people's skins, winning their confidence, presenting yourself in a certain way, the old hitchhiking trick.
Right.
And I was really, really interested.
Well,
you should be writing. Get back to Sarajevo, but take a typewriter.
Well, I mean, and it's funny because that's actually, I approached this interview series the same way I approach my writing. Is I don't do a lot of prep work. I do a little bit of prep work, but I don't have a list of questions. I want to meet you. I want to hear what you say, and I want to start reacting to you, because who knows where it's going to go. Because I find that to be more interesting than wanting to know, what character you want to have dinner with or those stock questions that you typically get. I'm curious about, there's a lot of things that are very interesting about you, and one of them is that that you're writing from different points of view, entire novels, but related, related series. How do you approach voice with that? Do you struggle to say, okay, well, this book now is going to be in somebody else's voice, and how do I make sure that is different and unique compared to what I just wrote? And do you have trouble kind of having unique voices when you're writing from different perspectives?
That's a very good question, and it's a particularly pertinent question because from the start, from the lead title, we, myself and the publisher, and thank God he was a World War II buff, and it's been a great journey, and he's really been part of it, and we get a lot of fun from it. But one of the ground rules we established was that he was happy to accept in the end was the notion of what I called soft linkage, which is the business of having a handful, around between half a dozen and a dozen characters who crop up, and they can be German, they can be American, they can be British, they can be Italian, and they will feature hugely or barely at all, depending on the demands of the story. And what I wanted to get away from was that, I think I've said before, was being shackled to one central narrative character whose voice I would understand in the end all too well. I mean, I spent 16 books in the world of crime fiction, which wasn't my idea at all. It was at the invitation of a big publisher, and they felt that I could do it well. What they didn't know was that I can't stand crime fiction, but the fridge was only half full at the time, so I really didn't have a choice. But I went the documentary route, and I spent what little money I had left for research purposes, getting amongst the detectives in the city where we were living, my wife and I. It's called Portsmouth, and it's God's gift to the working novelist, particularly crime novel. And going back to the start of the current series, Spoils of War, these ground rules we set down also made room for something that I wanted to do for a long time, which was to mix fictional characters and factual characters in the history of the Third Reich. Brief figures, trying to get their terms of voice was absolutely fascinating. And so if I give you some examples, I mean, from the current book, the book's about to come out in the States, Last Flight to Stalingrad, it's Goebbels, Joseph Goebbels. So how do you get inside his head? He's not going to be driving a car that stops to pick me up. He's not going to give me a lift. I won't have the pleasure and the privilege of meeting him in person. So what's the next best thing? Well, I read his diaries, and I read what few letters that he left, and I try and understand him, meet him, refracted through other people's accounts of him. And I go into some depth and detail about the kind of women that he liked, starting with his wife, Magda, and a Czech starlet called Lida Barova. And so I gradually crept up on him. And in the end, I didn't start the book until I knew that I had a very good fist on the page of being Goebbels.
Yeah.
And one of the people, and this I found absolutely fascinating, is wherever you look in the upper reaches of the Third Reich, whether it's to Goebbels, whether it's von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, whether it's Hitler himself, whether it's all these people are paranoid, neurotic. The barbarism and the savagery of the tribal is just incredible, and they trust no one.
Right.
Which means they lead a very lonely life. Now that gave me the entree, literally, for the character who carries this particular book. And he's Georgian, and he's reinvented himself, and he's a journalist of genius. He's exactly the kind of guy that Goebbels would seize on because he shares so much of Goebbels' personal view. His name is, Werner Neyman. Could I get his tone of voice? And because he's so cynical, and because he's so funny, the minute he walks into the book on page 1, I you like bar, and it's a strange town, and you're there for whatever reason you're there. And it used to happen a lot in the world of TV. There's a total stranger on the bar stool beside you, and you can tell within 30 seconds whether you're going to spend, the next 2 hours shooting the breeze with him or not. And it's to do with tone of voice, it's to do with body language, it's to do with the story he wants to tell you and how brief and how funny it is, all that stuff. And
Right.
and Werner Neyman, in terms of tone of voice, was a gift, real.
Yeah. Well, and there's something so pleasurable about developing a character who's kind of evil, but ultimately charming, and is the person you're going to want to spend a couple hours next to in a bar. And having that kind of voice can be a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's right. I remember when I was writing, I wrote a series of 12 crime fictions that were spooled around the same character. And the lead character was a man called Faraday, Joe Faraday. And he was a much abused and DI. And he was cursed by being honest. He didn't cut corners. He was a manic bird watcher. He got a deaf mute son. His private life was a car crash. And I knew after writing the first chapter that this series to come he would not sustain it alone. And I brought in a second character, and he was much more like Werner Neyman, and his name was Paul Winter, and he was a badass. I mean, absolute badass, and he took all the shortest cuts and he stitched people up, etc. And the minute he walked onto the page, I knew, because the devil always gets the best tunes. And he certainly had the best tunes, and the tension between the two characters was what was able to float the series in the end, and made it a real pleasure to write. I have to say.
Well, what's so impressive about what you do, and this is where you and I are very different, is especially when you start tackling historical fiction, just the sheer amount of research that you have to do. And obviously I can tell you must enjoy that, because you were documentarian, like you like to read, you like the fact gathering. Whereas I don't care for that at all. But I love reading historical fiction. I'm always so in awe of it. And then the idea of weaving in your fictional characters into this historical tapestry. What are the challenges of that, and how often are you able to kind of get away with a little bit of leeway and making up your own things, as opposed to somebody's really saying, well, it wasn't exactly like that, you need to rewrite this?
Okay, well, I think first of all, I don't want to sound glib, but all fiction is an act of trespass.
Yeah,
I mean, you are
true.
trespassing on
True.
people's
Yep.
lives and so forth. And in this sense, I'm trespassing on an entire war. So that's 6 years, 5.5, 6 years of mayhem. And I owe it to the reader, and I owe it to myself, and I owe it to the real life characters that I've kidnapped for the purposes of trying to make myself incredibly rich. To try and get this thing right. So I've got to understand the geography of the war. I've got to understand the chronology of the war. I've got to be absolutely at peace with knowing who did what to whom when. And then when it comes down to selecting, I'll give you an example. I'm currently doing the research for book 8, which is about an opposed landing, the Dieppe raid in 1942, which turned out to be a complete catastrophe. There's a very interesting real life story there, but I've got to do loads and loads of reading around that. And once I've done that, once I know that I'm pitch perfect, then I can release my characters. And by book 5, which is the Stalingrad book, I've got to know these guys well, and I've got and I can hear them in my head. I know the way they look, the way they smell. I know what kind of music they like. I know how they behave under pressure, all that kind of stuff. And then by intermingling them with characters, real life characters like Goebbels, who I've taken great trouble to try and get to know as much as I can 70 years on, through the medium of what they themselves have written. That then becomes a very interesting dance. And I can only you will know, as every writer knows, and I know, that if I'm writing a particular sequence, and on a very good day, the sequence might last for 4 or 5 pages. It might have lots of dialogue in it, and you can sit back from the PC at the end of that last page and think, well, where did that come from?
Mm-hmm.
You know, well, even rereading it, because you just know it's worked, and you know it will surprise the reader and gladden the reader. Why? Because it's just surprised you, right, and gladdened you. And I find, and that, dare I say it, and happens more and more often, and that's a function of the time and effort I've gladly spent, invested in getting the small print right. So, to take a tiny example, on the road to Stalingrad, in the middle of the featureless steppe, is a scruffy old airfield called Tatsinskaya. Now, I've never been there in my life, but thanks to the miracle of the internet, I can go there, I can have a browse, I can almost smell it. Right. And again, I can raid first-hand accounts from the period, from 1941-42, particularly the winter months when it's bitterly cold, and you can taste that wind sweeping in from the east. Oh, it's amazing stuff. Yeah. And thank God for central heating. I mean, you know. And thank God we didn't die this morning.
Right. And you're right. It's interesting when you are writing and that moment of inspiration comes up and you're not even necessarily aware of it, but two characters are talking and all of a sudden they start discussing something you hadn't planned, you hadn't thought about, and you're just letting it happen. And it doesn't, and it works a lot of the time because you have, again, built that muscle where, you know, on a subconscious level, this is probably going to work because I know what's happening, even though if I hadn't planned it. And sometimes it doesn't work, but you want to write it anyway, because who knows where it might lead to. There are a lot of times where I have to go back and like, oh, I love, that's why I have a tattoo that says "Kill Your Darlings." There might be a whole section that I loved writing this, but it doesn't serve the story. And, you know, that's obviously where it's also helpful to have editors come in. And, you know, I don't think any writer, and correct me if I'm wrong, is at the point where you can go back and look at your first draft and know exactly what needs to be cut, what needs to be added, what needs to be changed. I'm constantly surprised by the feedback I get, in a good way, by the editing staff. And I get my editorial notes and I'm like, wow, you are absolutely right on all of these comments. And I don't know if I would have seen that myself. Do you have that same experience, or do you feel after all the novels you've written that you turn in a pretty complete package every time?
Well, I think there's a huge contrast here. When I was writing crime fiction, these are contemporary books. And by definition, they address a world that we all know. I'm on much surer ground as a writer, given the amount of research I've invested in writing this current series, the historical series, Spoils of War series, because there isn't an editor in-house who's read all those books. So their judgment is going to come down to their judgment of my honesty. You know, have I got it
that's
right?
Interesting. Yeah.
And they will, and I'm sure they do. To return to the airfield, they will Google Tatsinskaya. They will compare the pictures that turn up on screen to the way I've described it, etc. And they may even read the odd book about a nonfiction book about Stalingrad. But by and large, they're going to take it on trust. And I have to say that there has been virtually no editorial interference at all.
That's wonderful.
It is. I can't believe it. The last 3 books, which was Estacada, Raid 42, and now Last Flight to Stalingrad, haven't changed a word, not one word.
Wow.
Which is music to my ears. Absolutely.
I get notes like, hey, can you add a subplot? So a little bit different.
One character enough.
All right. On that note, we're going to do a little storytelling, and so how this is going to work is I'm going to pick a book off the shelf behind me. You're going to pick a page and a sentence, and I'm going to read it. You give me a couple sentences, I'll do a couple sentences. We can take it whatever direction we want, short, couple minutes, and I'll call an end to it. But it's usually a lot of fun. So I'm gonna see if I can find a World War II themed book. I'll see. This one popped out at me. I actually have a whole biography of Goebbels. I was going to grab that, but I thought that might challenge. Cool. That might be a hard sentence to start with. So this is Unbroken, which is a fantastic book, nonfiction. Obviously, it's tremendous.
Who's the author?
It's Laura Hillenbrand, and it's essentially about an American who gets shot down, and he's in a war camp in Japan. But it's nonfiction. It's tremendous. So give me a page between 1 and 400.
107.
Okay. And maybe a sentence between 1 and 5.
Can you go to 7? It's my lucky number.
All right. This is short and sweet. For a moment, the landing was perfect.
Then came my realization that he'd forgotten to put the wheels down.
That sinking feeling the seconds before touchdown, not knowing if every moment that I've ever lived would suddenly evaporate in the next several.
That, in a strange way, was a comfort, because what was awaiting me on the assumption that we would survive the coming few minutes, I was already dreading.
I was surprised that I didn't have a sense of wanting to reach out to my wife, of wanting to say goodbye. She barely occurred to me at all as the metal first made contact with the tarmac.
And it was in that moment that I realized that she'd been cheating on me for years and years and years.
Suddenly I wanted to survive more than I'd ever in my entire life. I would get back home one way or another.
The plane finally came to a halt, and I looked out of the window, and I couldn't believe my eyes.
My wife was there waiting for me on the tarmac. She had flown in, and I had no idea how that had even been arranged. And I thought for a moment she was a ghost, or more accurately, perhaps, that I was.
With her was a small man in uniform. He could have been Japanese, but I wasn't entirely sure.
I managed to get out of the aircraft, surprisingly in one piece, still uncertain that I was even actually alive. I walked up to her and expected her to throw her arms around me, but she just stood there.
The first movement came from the man in uniform. He stepped towards me. He gave a short, sharp bow. He said, "I know your name." He had a strange accent. I looked at my wife. My wife looked at me, and she said, "Are you aware that this man is your brother?"
I didn't know what to say, but I could tell by the way that he looked at me that this was the truth. He handed me an envelope and told me to read what was inside.
My hands were shaking. I finally managed to open the envelope. Inside were 3 folded sheets of paper. I got them all out. The first paper was in Japanese. On the second sheet of paper, there was a message for me, and you have no idea what it said. But what it said brought a chill to my heart.
I'm going to call it there because I have no idea where that goes next. That was good.
It's funny. I've never done that before. It's very interesting.
I love doing that because there's such because I do it every time. It's so interesting for me to be able to see how I connect with the person, how our energy flows, sometimes the story gets like super dark depending on who it is. And it's always fascinating to see where it goes. So that was well done. And there was no hesitation. Sometimes there's like long lulls. But sometimes it flows.
You have to build the tension. Yeah,
that's right.
Actually, it's very interesting because when I was in TV to begin with, and I was writing promo scripts. I mean, for good money, I couldn't believe how much they paid me to write rubbish. And I was sharing a house with three other guys, and one guy was an actor by trade, and he was an on-air presenter, and a really good guy. And he, like me, wanted to get into print, and he, like me, had completely failed to get into print. And so we decided to co-write a book, and we took it in turns. We wrote successive chapters, and very quickly, because we were deeply competitive, we just set each other impossible traps. And of course, the book got nowhere commercially. It was just rejected and rejected and rejected. But my God, we had some great nights at the pub. It was fantastic.
That's great. Yeah, well, that's exactly the same thing. Well, Graham, what a pleasure to talk to you and to meet you, and to, trust me, I have another 2 hours worth of questions for you, but we don't have time for it. But you're you're a very fascinating person, and I appreciate hearing about your journey into publication. And yeah, I really thank you for your time.
Not at all. It's been a pleasure. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Cheers.
That was my conversation with Graham. He was an interesting guy. Like I said, I didn't know him before going into this interview, so it was great to kind of hear his story and all the things that he's done in his life. Pretty amazing. If you want to find out more about Graham, you can just go to his website, which is grahamhurley.co.uk. If you want to find out more about me or subscribe to my newsletter, please do that, because they are awesome and I work hard on them. You can just go to carterwilson.com. So that's it for this episode. More episodes coming out soon. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.